before I went to Syria, when I was leaving the US, I was telling my friends that I was moving now. And I had a few people ask me, like, where is it? Someone asked me, like, is it in Africa? You know, and I had somebody ask me, or someone tell me to bring my bulletproof vest because it's such a dangerous place just because it's in the Middle East, really, which is not true at all. Before the pre-revolution, Syria is actually the safest place I've lived in ever, too. Like, the safest.
Just unfortunate situations, violence, religion.
To be honest, terrorist. And things like it's all over the media, so like we watch that every day.
The main thing that comes up to mind is religion. It's a very conservative place for the beliefs and systems that was built upon there.
So I was living in Syria at the beginning of the revolution, which just started in the spring of 2011. And while I was there, riots hadn't really started, and like, the civil war hadn't really started in my city of Aleppo. It's called Aleppo, the city I was living in. Riots hadn't started there yet, but at the same time you're watching the news, and you're watching BBC and CNN International and Al Jazeera, and they were showing, the media was portraying like these really gruesome war scenes, and they were making it seem like it was spread throughout the country, throughout our city even though we barely saw anything, we could barely hear anything.
So obviously there is a long history of media representation of the Oriental, and that's been, for the most part, uninformed, biased, and mostly using an Orientalist framework to talk about the Middle East and Arabs and Islam, and oftentimes journalists have a tendency to use cliches or stereotypes about the region that are not only incorrect but also have a long tradition of racism and prejudice about people who live in that region. For men, oftentimes it's a violent person, it's a person who is a fundamentalist or a fanatic, a Muslim. Obviously, you don't see many Christian, although there are many Christians who live in Arab countries. And their hatred for the West and for Europe and the US, and their need to destroy that civilization, and all these different tensions. And for women, again, there are different tropes. We don't see many unveiled women, we don't see many secular women, we don't see many outspoken women, although these women do exist, and so on. And the other trope is to represent these women as desirable, as the belly dancers, and there are many examples of that in movies, in Hollywood movies, and so on. So that's, I would say, that's really the main problem with the media, the reductive kind of approach to understanding the region, and usage of ready-made images that they draw from Orientalist culture and so on.
I guess your first thoughts are, of course, what you see from the news, because that's just what it's shown in our culture. But when I went there, I saw something different. I got to go to Israel, fortunately, and while I was there, I got to go to the West Bank. I got to be near the Gaza Strip. I got to see Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, and you see like the beauty of all these places, and there's a lot more to it. And unfortunately, that's not depicted in the media.
It's often portrayed more as as Arabs as terrorists, or as violent, or as fanatic concerning their religion, but it's really not how it is at all.
I think a lot of things, I'm from China, so like when I see a lot of Western media, they are always sort of biased. So when I kind of perceive the problems in the Middle East and how the Western media are reporting on the Middle East, I kind of like can understand that they kind of having those biased opinions.
Obviously, mainstream media representation is motivated by politics, politics and culture, and should be read as such, as part of a whole apparatus. So the media doesn't just operate independently. The media is not just about informing. The media is actually part of an entire apparatus, and that's a multidimensional apparatus. Politics is part of it, the economy is part of it, and so on. And the incentive oftentimes for journalists and for the media is, again, to further the interest of the countries they are from. So if it's a US media, then they are going to reproduce the main narrative or the main discourses in the US, and same thing with Europe. And that's obviously motivated by the interest of Europe and the US in the region. And they could be identified. There are many factors, but the most important are oil and oil interest in the region, Israel and the conflict between the Israeli and the Palestinian, Iran and its nuclear program and its politics toward the West, the US and Europe, in addition to the question of Islam and fundamentalism and terrorism and Al-Qaeda and so on. I think those are really the main factors for the media, and they influence the way the media is going to represent that region.
The majority of the people in the Middle East, they're not advocating at all for violence or for fanaticism or for intolerance, anything like that. And that's what I think is the misconception for many Americans and many Westerners who are watching the news.
Yeah, we, as an American, we see that, like, at least through our culture, that it looks like the Middle East is like this very awful place where there's just evil and there's terror and all this stuff, and we clearly don't have an accurate depiction of that.
You hear every day about like suicide bombings, or this place attacked, this place bomb goes off, this many people killed. So when that's really the only thing that you hear from that area, you tend to form an opinion of this place is literally just a battle zone and there's nothing else going on, which is not true.
The emergence of Al-Qaeda as a main player more recently really transformed the reporting from Syria and about Syria. And the dominant narrative and dominant story in the West has been Al-Qaeda. The reduction of a multidimensional and extremely complex revolution to its military dimension only, as if it was only that. Obviously, the revolution is much more than that. There is a cultural and there is a social and there is an economic aspect that are completely invisible and hidden to journalists in the West. And the reason for that is the military aspect is always much more sensational, it's spectacular. It's oftentimes what the readership or the audience wants to see. It's much more intriguing and entertaining than the other aspect, the cultural and social and so on. But I think that hides the reality on the ground. My suggestion is, on the one hand, train journalists to understand better the region, send journalists who speak the language, not just English, and ask journalists to try to avoid the Orientalist framework and Orientalist culture, which has a tendency to actually reproduce narrative and tropes that are already available, rather than try to understand and tell us anything meaningful about the region.
A friend gave me some really good advice. His name's Jake, and he spent a year in Israel last year. And he said that in terms of news outlets, Al Jazeera or Al Jazeera America is probably the most accurate news source you can go to for not only things in the Middle East, like all over the world, but especially in the Middle East, because they are not affiliated necessarily with an American agenda or a Western agenda. They're just providing facts, and they know that region because it is their region.
When I was living in Syria, my family and I would go for walks or for bike rides out in the countryside, and every single person we came across, every single person, a stranger, they're complete strangers, they'd always invite us into their house for tea, and they'd give us a meal, and they'd really welcome us. They really welcome us. And I haven't run into that anywhere else in the world. They're really the most hospitable people I've ever met. And it is a tradition. Being hospitable is a tradition. It is something of great importance in the Middle East in general, and the Arab countries in general.
A good friend of mine, she's from Istanbul, and but she knows like how the Western people are misunderstood them, and she is not really Muslim, as like she was born in Istanbul, so it's not really that Middle East. But like, and I have a good friend. She's not necessarily from Middle East, but like she's Muslim and she lives in Sarajevo, which is like the only Muslim country in the Europe. And I've been to Sarajevo, and I've been to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and like before I always thought like Muslim people are really violent, really aggressive, and blah blah blah. And when I went to Sarajevo, it was like the most peaceful city that I've never been.
Syria has by far had the nicest, most hospitable people I have ever met anywhere in the world so far. And this is also true of the people in Jordan, of the people in Turkey, of the people in Lebanon. They're really so welcoming, and that's part of the Arab tradition.
For myself personally, I can say just going there and just seeing it for yourself is one thing. When I returned, I decided that I wanted to become more educated on the topic, and I took a few online classes that helped, I guess, strengthen my knowledge on the subject. I've read some books on it also, about, again, with like just life in the region, and some of the conflicts that have gone there, and even some of like those stories of people that just aren't even a part of those conflicts, just normal people like you and me that just unfortunately have to like be exposed to that.
I think all news channels in general, like all news stations, all newspapers, whatever, magazines, I think they really need to start getting better at talking to the actual people who are in it or who were in it, rather than just taking statistics and like death tolls and that sort of thing. I think it'd be much more constructive and informative if there were more like special programs really getting to know people, like people who could represent, the Syrian population, instead of just sticking to the war scenes and the fighting scenes that you see normally. Because our world is turning into a global society, it's not so spread out anymore. People aren't so disconnected anymore. And so I think in order to advance that and make people more tolerant of each other and more accepting, that we really need to start showing actual people on the news and actual lives and actual stories.
I think first of all we need to bring more positive influences of the Middle Eastern people. Maybe get to know more about their cultures and get to know more about the people there, and watch more because Iranians they have really good movies. They're good filmmakers. We can know their culture through movies and stuff.
So what could be done? There are many things. For example, organizing a movie festival where students are exposed to Iranian cinema or the Arab cinema, which is extremely interesting and speaks a language that's quite different from the language you see with Hollywood and the US cinema and so on. They could also organize panels on some of those questions, and I think there is a lot of interest at Emerson, and I would think that many students would attend those panels. Panels that really demystify the region and engage with some of the real questions about that region, and try to engage with some of those narrative about Islam and women and patriarchy and so on. I think those are important questions, but they should be discussed, not reduced to just a few cliches.